Good evening. I welcome you all to the fourth lecture of the webinar series of the Archaeological Sciences Center, IIT Gandhinagar. We have started this webinar series since October 2020. Uh, lectures by eminent scholars, archaeologists, historians, organized towards the end of every month, and it is aimed to reach scholars, students, and the public alike. This lecture series, we have so far had three lectures by eminent speakers in the field of prehistory, and from this lecture onwards, we are starting a new journey altogether, and we are embarking into the Harappan civilization. And today, we have with us an eminent scholar, Professor Nayanjot Lahiri, who is at present professor at Ashoka University, and she is well known. She doesn't need any introduction. She is well known through her researches, through her writings, particularly on various aspects of Indian history. Particularly, he has written on Ahom history, on Ashoka, on the discovery of the Harappan civilization, on the trade routes of ancient India, and her more recent book on Deshpande, the former Director General of Archaeological Survey of India, is an eye-opener to understand various aspects on the great personality. I welcome Professor Lahiri, and I really thank her on behalf of IIT Gandhinagar to have found time to deliver this talk on the discovery of the Harappan civilization, on the background of the discovery of the Harappan civilization, which is the earliest urbanization of the subcontinent. I welcome you again, Professor Lahiri, on behalf of IIT Gandhinagar, and I request you to deliver the talk. Thank you.
I want to thank IIT Gandhinagar for inviting me to deliver this lecture. It's good to be back with friends, even if it is virtually speaking. My lecture this evening is on the discovery of the Indus civilization. I use the term Indus and Harappan civilization interchangeably in this lecture. As you know, the discovery of this civilization was announced on 20th September 1924 in the Illustrated London News by the scholar archaeologist John Marshall, who happened to be the Director General of the Archaeological Survey at that point in time. The announcement and its discovery dramatically altered perceptions of India's civilizational antiquity by actually pushing back the dates of urbanism and an urban Bronze Age phenomenon back to the third millennium. The 1924 announcement, of course, was the culmination of a trajectory which goes well back into the 19th century. And in my book, Finding Forgotten Cities, I have actually provided a full narrative history of how the civilization was unearthed from Harappa in Punjab and Mohenjo-daro in Sindh. Actually, when I began that book, it was not meant to be a narrative of the Indus civilization. It was intended to be an intellectual biography of John Marshall in the life and times genre. But because of a treasure trove of files that I discovered in the Archaeological Survey of India, I came upon a great deal that was unknown about the discovery of the civilization. So that's what I wrote about. Now, what I'm going to try to do today is a little different. I'm going to re-examine the story that I've told in that book in order to see how the process of archaeological discovery, in this case, can be juxtaposed with the literature on scientific discoveries. Now, before I get into that, I just want to point out that the direction of the Indus discovery was different from most other discoveries that have impacted the study of antiquity. Unlike accounts which are retrospectively told as neat narratives by their discoverers, whether it was Henrik Schliemann in the case of Troy or Arthur Evans in the case of Minoan Crete, this is a story which actually cannot be written around or thought about in terms of a hero and one who already knew the significance of what he was about to uncover. Rather, the credit for discovering the Harappan civilization uh, goes to several archaeologists, most of whom were connected with the Archaeological Survey of India in various ways, which was then, as it is today, a government department. Equally, some of these archaeologists, quite unexpectedly and without any planning on their part, discovered clues which would eventually change the way the Indian past was visualized. So, in some ways, this actually fits in with what histories of science have increasingly revealed, that scientific discoveries are actually infinitely more haphazard than they appear in received accounts of scientific genius. The second point I just want to make is that in the case of the Indus civilization, there is actually no received account about how the discovery unfolded. None of the characters who actually penned retrospective details about it actually wrote a full narrative or wrote their memoirs, nor have any notebooks or diaries been found where the enigma of the Indus civilization and how it unraveled came to be recorded. So instead of this, all that you have is piles of government files which contain a lot of correspondence. They contain notes and notings, the sorts of stuff that you often find within government portals. But I think this kind of source material has a huge advantage in that it was not produced to provide a very neat post facto version of how India's ancient civilizational past came to be recovered. So, using this kind of material, I'm going to try to answer the question, how did this archaeological discovery unfold? And how can it contribute to the larger theoretical discussion about the phenomena of the discovery, especially the patterns pertaining to scientific discoveries? So, for instance, I found the whole idea of a slow hunch, which is used in exploring patterns of innovation and scientific breakthroughs, very useful. There's a very well known book, it's a bestseller written by Stephen Johnson, which is called Where Good Ideas Come From. And it explores this in some detail. Johnson actually provides many examples of the slow hunch. And for instance, he talks about Joseph Priestley, who, in deciding to seal a mint sprig in glass, which ultimately proved the fact that plants created oxygen, was building upon an insight that went back to his boyhood. The young Priestley had apparently trapped spiders in glass jars in his boyhood, in the belief, as he put it, that there was something that was very interesting in the way organisms perished when you sealed them in closed vessels, something that pointed, as he put it, to a larger truth. The important point was to keep the hunch alive at the back of his mind, which eventually bloomed some 2 decades later after he first began thinking about perished spiders in sealed containers. Now, Priestley's slow building up around an early inkling is strongly reminiscent of John Marshall's sense about the possibility of pushing back the antiquity of India. This is a photograph of Marshall before he came as the Director General, I think just a month and a half before. And the idea of a Bronze Age phenomenon was actually incubating in his mind very soon after this. So it incubated in his mind for more than 20 years. Marshall came to India as the Director General in 1902. Before that, while preparing for his departure, he actually examined many objects of Indian origin in England, including 3 British Museum seals of Harappa, which were inscribed in an unknown script. So why he was looking at these seals is another matter. We can maybe talk about that during the discussion. But the point I want to make is that it was only in 1924 that Marshall would preside over the discovery of the Harappan civilization, a discovery which had much to do with the sorts of seals that he had first examined in 1902. So Marshall's, in fact, is a classic case of the slow hunch that Stephen Johnson talked about. Here was an archaeologist who, from the early 1900s, intuitively imagined that there was an unknown canvas which, which would push back the antiquity of India's civilization, by millennia. But yet, this is something which fructified in a positive sense only many decades later. Now, we know about Marshall's intuition because in 1903, he deputed an ASI man called Hiranand Shastri to survey sites in North India, which had yielded copper objects in the form of hoards. We now call these copper hoard sites. This is because he thought that such objects belonged to an age of bronze, which could be correlated with the Rig Veda. Now, as it so happened, there was nothing that was unearthed by Hiranand, which would allow Marshall to substantiate this connection. And it was in only 1924 that the reality of literate Bronze Age was firmly established. But the point I'm trying to make is that as early as 1903, the prism through which Marshall viewed the Indian past was one that accommodated the notion of a Bronze Age. In the same year, that is 1903, other clues about an unknown segment of Indian history were uncovered from Balochistan by Hughes Buller. Some of you may have heard of Hughes Buller because he compiled these fantastic gazetteers of Balochistan. He was an ICS man, but he saw himself as a kind of amateur archaeologist. And in 1903, he wrote to Marshall about 59 polychrome bowls that a member of his staff, Mirza Sher Muhammad, had found at a place called Nal. Now, when photographs like this, and this comes from Hughes Buller's report, reached Marshall, he actually declared that if other objects were discovered, there could be a real possibility of having got back to a date that was as yet unrepresented in the Northwest by such antiquities. He soon also felt confident enough to state that this pottery could be allied to Mycenaean pottery of the 8th century BCE. Now, retrospectively, these are very interesting observations. First, his reaction to link Nal with the Mediterranean makes sense in the light of his own background. Marshall had actually received his field training in the Mediterranean. Second, and although this was not immediately followed up for various reasons, his intuition that Nal would push back the existing chronology of Balochistan has proved to be correct. Nal is today recognized as part of the background to the birth of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. So it's actually even older than Marshall had imagined it to be. In fact, after the announcement of 1924, Marshall himself would depute one of his officers to excavate it in order to understand how it synchronized with the Indus civilization. And I believe that he took this decision to get Nal excavated because of the glimpse that he had had of its pottery more than 20 years before in the autumn of 1903. So in other words, John Marshall's teething years saw the discovery of clues in the form of artifacts, which he considered as being unrepresentative of the then available narrative of ancient India. But of course, having said that, it also has to be admitted that these clues were actually not pursued by him with any degree of urgency. Now, the site of Harappa, and this is one of the first photographs of the mounds of Harappa. This was taken in 1914. But if you just think of, Harappa and Marshall, the fact that he didn't pursue things with an urgency is evident from the fact that even though he had seen the seals before he came to India, the British Museum seals, it was eventually excavated only in 1921. Of course, as the ASI files have revealed, Harappa was a place which was actually considered by him for a dig much before the crucial 1921 excavation. Marshall had actually begun the process of excavating it in 1907. He had gone on long leave a year before that, back to England, and at that point he had re-examined the Harappa seals. And after returning to India, he then set in motion the administrative process necessary for beginning excavations there. So he wrote to the Deputy Commissioner of the Montgomery area. Montgomery was the district where Harappa was. And, the Deputy Commissioner wrote back in 1908 to say that the mounds of Harappa, which Marshall was interested in, could be bought from the owners for a little over 4,000 rupees. Now, at that point in time, this was roughly 1/4 of what the government usually spent on excavations across India. So before finalizing his purchase, Marshall wanted some kind of archaeological feasibility report prepared. So 3 such reports were prepared, and I'm not going to go into the details here. They're all there in my book. But this tells us, what the point I'm trying to make is that this tells you something about the kinds of constraints within which field research was undertaken in British India, where actually government departments that were non-commercial worked on very small budgets. In fact, within a couple of years after the 1909 report on Harappa, the Indian government, in order to cut down its spending, recommended abolishing a number of posts, and that included the post of the Director General of Archaeology. Marshall's job was actually eventually saved because of an active campaign in England, which was spearheaded by 2 former viceroys, that is Lord Curzon and the 4th Earl of Minto. He then returned to his job eventually, that is his old job, in 1912. So Marshall's interest in Harappa and its very intriguing seals all kinds of extraneous challenges and constraints. It was not just a question of sustaining his intuition at the back of his mind, as has been the case with scientists who have pursued hunches, but in doing so in the face of inadequate department budgets and job uncertainty. One reason that Marshall's hunch regarding Harappa reached fruition so many years later has to actually do with these constraints. That Harappa, of course, remained on Marshall's mind even as circumstances unrelated to archaeology put his excavations on a back burner can actually be explored a little further. And this brings us to the report on Harappa, which was prepared in 1914 by a very senior officer of the ASI, Harold Hargreaves. It reveals a plan of action. In fact, this is a photograph which you see of the mounds of Harappa, which was taken by Hargreaves. And if you look at his report, it actually provides a specific time frame within which the excavations were to be done. And even though he saw a lot of depredation at the mounds, he did recommend excavations. So not only that, he also provided photographs, of, for example, the Nauga's shrine, where Chalcolithic ring stones, as we now recognize them to be of the Harappan civilization, were being actively worshipped. And he provided photographs of seals. Now, after this, Marshall asked the civil authorities in Montgomery to begin the process of acquiring land so that Hargreaves could then excavate in the winter of the following year. So all indications were that the excavations of Harappa, which John Marshall had first contemplated in 1906, would now finally take place in 1915. But again, excavations did not take place. The reason for this was the Great War, or what we call World War I today, which began in 1914. Its outbreak led to a massive war effort on the part of British India in the form of money and men. India made cash contributions to the British war expenditure to the tune of 367 million pounds. And obviously, marshalling resources on this scale, if one may say so, meant less money for Marshall and for departments like the Archaeological Survey. In fact, in the ASI, there was now a palpable crunch. Ongoing excavations were suspended, and in some instances, a moratorium on new excavations was announced. Many officers of the Archaeological Survey also proceeded to Europe's Western Front to fight, including Harold Hargreaves. So here again, there's a configuration of political events related to the theater of war, which was far removed from India, which further actually slowed the process of pursuing the clues from Harappa. In fact, after Hargreaves left, in a few years, in place of him, it was Dayaram Sahni, the man you associate with the excavations of the 1921 excavations of Harappa, who was brought in. And, what he did, I will mention very shortly. But before looking at Sahni's excavation, let us for a moment just stay with the warriors, because in adjacent Rajputana, as Rajasthan was then called, another trail became visible around this time. This concerns the path of a scholar of languages from Italy, Luigi Pio Tessitori, who around the time that Hargreaves was surveying Harappa, appears to have been spiritedly scouting around the desert states of Jodhpur and Bikaner. It was this Italian who would go on to explore and excavate the Kalibangan mounds, which, like those of Harappa, are now regarded as containing the remnants of a city of Indus antiquity. Tessitori is very important because his contribution is little known, and Tessitori's case is actually strongly reminiscent of what has often happened in the sciences, where there can be multiple independent discoveries and several people may actually arrive at a new idea around the same time. That's the case, for instance, with calculus. And of course, who gets the credit depends upon a number of things. Tessitori's is a classic archaeological study that illustrates something similar in the world of archaeological discovery. Tessitori was a very accomplished linguist. We know him mainly because of the work he's done on West Indian vernaculars, although his degree thesis from Florence University was on the Ram Katha. His thesis involved a comparison of Valmiki's Ramayana with the Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas. But while he was in Italy, and after having submitted his thesis, and while he was looking at various texts from Western India and copies of manuscripts, he became intensely keen to get a job in India, to get close to where these manuscripts were kept. And he was in touch with various authorities. On the one hand, with an extraordinary Jain Acharya called Vijay Dharamsuri. Vijay Dharamsuri was very well known to European language scholars. And on the other hand, with the India office, hoping that his old mentor George Grierson could get him a job as a teacher of Latin or Greek or Italian in a school or a college which was nearest to Rajputana. With Vijay Dharmasuri, Tessitori would subsequently build up a very close relationship. Tessitori actually considered him to be his Param Pujya Guru. He also wrote his biography, and through him, he actually got an insight, a direct insight into Jain monastic life. But it was on the recommendations of George Grierson, the director of the Linguistic Survey of India, that he was appointed to work on the Bardic Chronicles of Rajputana. These had actually been collected by the Asiatic Society of Bengal. And in April 1914, Tessitori reached Calcutta to begin his work on these manuscripts. But he soon realized that actually the Asiatic Society collection was made up of very poor copied manuscripts. So he proceeded to Jodhpur to begin a field work on his Bardic survey. So the idea was to visit village after village, town after town, see the bhandars, look at the manuscripts there. So his work was actually proceeding very well. But then because of World War I in 1916, his funds for the project were halved. And it was at this point in time, because of the good work that he had done, John Marshall stepped in and told him that the Archaeological Survey would support his work financially, provided that when he toured the desert states, he would also search for antiquarian remains apart from collecting manuscripts. So that's how a linguist became a kind of archaeologist. Now, the state that I'm going to talk about is Bikaner. Bikaner, perhaps of all the states in Rajputana, is the one in which conditions for archaeological exploration were most unfavorable. The distance between one village and another, the imperviousness of the vast tracts of loose sand to all means of conveyance but the camel, these are some of the conditions that Tessitori talked about in his reports. But this was compensated by the discovery, especially in the northern part of the state, of an extremely interesting archaeological field. Along the bank of the Ghaggar, Tessitori documented large mounds covered with brickbats and potsherds, and of these, it is Kalibangan which is of intrinsic interest to the story. Tessitori actually first visited Kalibangan in April 1917, and he went back there subsequently in December 1918. And he tells us in his report, it's an unpublished report, that he had the good fortune to, I quote, discover vestiges of a very remote, if not prehistoric antiquity. The words that he used, remote, if not prehistorical antiquity, these words are important. The report is very long, so I just want to point out that the report mentions a range of artifacts that he found there: terracotta cakes, bones, pottery, fragments of copper, seashells. And there are photographs like this of some of the structures that were excavated. These photographs are there in the albums of the Archaeological Survey Photo Library. And more important, perhaps, what he did not mention in his report. But I suppose this is what he meant when he talked about a prehistorical antiquity, and that is long stone blades, flints, which are now on display in the Ganga Singh Golden Jubilee Museum in Bikaner, as also seals. Now, this juxtaposition of artifacts, that is pottery along with seals and stone blades, was exactly what Cunningham in the early 1870s had found at Harappa. And undoubtedly, if John Marshall had known about this, he would have realized that this was a new type of culture that stretched from Harappa to Kalibangan. So how is it that this did not become public knowledge? Now, I think it's possible that Tessitori decided to discreetly keep silent about this until he had actually sorted out the age and the context for himself. I think he already had a sense that these were prior to what was archaeologically known about the historical period. That's why he uses the term prehistorical antiquity. So he is as much a forerunner in unearthing an Indus site in Rajputana as Cunningham was in the context of Harappa. Perhaps much more so because, unlike Cunningham, who considered Harappa to have been the locale of a Buddhist establishment during the time of Xuanzang, Tessitori's first thought was to place his discovery within prehistoric perimeters. But Cunningham, in many ways, was more fortunate than Tessitori. He lived on to publish his account of Harappa, and so he made his presence known to those of us who have an interest in the cities and the story of their discovery. Tessitori's traveling of Kalibangan, on the other hand, is little known because before he could actually put together his observations for publication, a very unfortunate turn of events came to unexpectedly swamp his life. It all began in early 1919, when after completing his tour of Rajputana, where he had revisited Kalibangan, Tessitori left for Italy because of his mother's illness. By the time he reached Italy, she had passed away, but he stayed on at Udine. He was from North Italy. And he stayed there for a few months. And during those months, he did share the information about the seals he had found at Kalibangan with one person, his old mentor, George Grierson. Now, if you look at the correspondence between them, Grierson is very excited, and he thinks that these are actually possibly Chinese inscriptions, an opinion, of course, that Tessitori did not agree with. So what Grierson told him was that it would be a good idea to get John Marshall's permission to publish these seals in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland, because that was a publication that lots of people, lots of scholars who actually worked with Asian languages read. And I think that's what Tessitori planned to do as soon as he returned to India. But his return journey proved to be fatal. He seems to have contracted Spanish influenza on the ship. So, you know, when the pandemic began, and I began to ask myself that where has the pandemic figured in my own writings? And it was really in the context of Tessitori. So he contracted the, Spanish flu, and within a few weeks of landing, he died of double pneumonia in November 1919 in Bikaner. He was buried not far from the fort of his friend and patron, Maharaja Ganga Singh. And apparently even now, on the anniversary of his death, scholars gather at his tomb, and many of them actually do so. These are Jain scholars. They do so because of the kind of philological scholarship that Tessitori represented. But I think only a few of them would know that on his death, there was also a kind of unforeseen ending to the beginning of what could have been a major tryst with things Harappan. This is because when Tessitori was buried at Bikaner, the knowledge of the Kalibangan seals was also buried with him. And that is why, until I began actually following his trail, he has not figured in accounts, of the discovery of the Harappan civilization. But to now return to Dayaram Sahni and his excavations at Harappa, which commenced in 1921. Excuse me. This is, the long trench. The picture that you see here is of a long trench that was, it's a very famous trench that was cut through by Dayaram Sahni. And what I tried to highlight when I've written about Sahni's excavation is that it was the result of a process that actually goes back to 1907. But of course, when Sahni went to excavate it in 1921, it was not John Marshall who actually was very interested in Harappa, but it was Sahni who did the actual work. And it was his work which led to a realization that the Harappa seals belonged to a phase that was definitely pre-Mauryan and that it could actually go back to 1000 BCE. Excuse me. So, when this assessment was made by, Dayaram Sahni, Marshall actually added a footnote where he said that there was still 50, feet of unexcavated deposits which were left, which would further lead to more valuable discoveries. So in 1921, the momentous nature of Harappa had only tentatively formed even in the minds of those archaeologists who were aware that this was actually a very old city. Soon after this, there were other unexpected breakthroughs by other scholars, both on and off the field. The cast of characters becomes much wider. And to understand how this unfolded, we have to actually move from Harappa to Mohenjo-daro, which is some 500 kilometers away. Of course, unlike Harappa, in the case of Mohenjo-daro, there was no slow hunch nor even a prior understanding that the excavations would lead to dramatic evidence. Those excavations had actually nothing to do with Marshall's planning. It was an officer who headed the Western Circle of the survey, Rakhaldas Banerjee, who for many years was actually very keen to excavate it. This is a 1925 photograph of Rakhaldas Banerjee, where he's holding a Mohenjo-daro pot very proudly. And, when he actually went to excavate the site, he went to excavate Buddhist Mohenjo-daro. So naturally, what he did was he first began looking at the citadel mound, which has a Buddhist stupa on top. This is an enlarged view of the stupa. And he began by concentrating on it because this is what he was interested in. It just so happens that when the eastern retaining wall of the stupa was excavated, one of his assistants, a man called Enes Chikte, made the momentous discovery of two inscribed seals. So Banerjee immediately realized that these were inscribed with characters that were very similar to, the seals that had been found at Harappa. But Mohenjo-daro, of course, was several hundred kilometers to the southwest of Harappa. And this certainly meant that Harappa was not a unique site, but what was being revealed was a distinctive culture. It was this, the fact that he had found and recognized seals of the Harappa type, which would later become the main reason why he would be remembered in the story of the discovery of the Indus civilization, where he would always be considered a very important protagonist. But I think for the moment, he just kept this to himself, the fact that these seals were found. And he only wrote in March 1923 to Marshall, telling him of what he had found. John Marshall, of course, was full of enthusiasm, and he told Banerjee that he should try and establish the chronology of the site and find out whether Mohenjo-daro was also pre-Mauryan, as Sahni thought that Harappa was. He also advised Banerjee to try to indicate the cultural connections of the people who produced the seals. Now, immediately, John Marshall himself could not do much because he was going on long leave in April 1923. Now, in the world of science, what had just happened at Mohenjo-daro, this is a very common kind of phenomena. That is, there is a chance finding or an unexpected discovery. This is exactly what happened in the case of Banerjee's excavation. But in the sciences, what really happens is that a lot depends on whether the concerned excavator can take advantage of what had been unexpectedly found. So as historians of science pointed out, scientists, when they capture such unknown and unexpected processes, they attend to these results, giving explanations, supporting them with analogies to very similar results obtained in other experiments. And if these unexpected results continue despite changes in methodology, then they form new models and theories. But of course, this did not happen in this case. Banerjee was actually hesitant to visualize a new framework on the basis of what had emerged from Mohenjo-daro, and his search for its cultural connections eventually boiled down to finding a place for the seal makers within the early spread of races. This was a kind of pigeonholing exercise which had a lot in common with the views of British historians who used to see India's ancient past as marked by races and civilizations being brought into India. So the man from Mohenjo-daro, in other words, was actually thinking of his discovery within this kind of framework, thinking sometimes of a Negroid group of people bringing this in, thinking of Dravidians bringing this into India. So it was unlikely to actually lead to any new way of visualizing this unknown culture. Now, this is with regard to Banerjee's discovery and limitation. What about Marshall? Interestingly, John Marshall, on his return later that year, that is 1923, did not actually visit either Mohenjo-daro or Harappa. Instead, he proceeded to Taxila, the city that he had been excavating for over 2 decades. And in fact, in doing this, he was just following routine, something that he religiously adhered to when digging Taxila. At the same time, I think Marshall should have realized that the 1923-24 field season was very unusual. It was unusual because both Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were being trenched in quick succession on his orders. But even then, he did not break routine to actually get a first-hand glimpse of the excavations. This was perfectly in character, but it is entirely possible that if he had actually gone to Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, the discovery of the Indus civilization would have unfolded sooner than the autumn of 1924. So what was it that eventually pushed Marshall to come to grips with the enigma of these two sites? It was the connections that one of his junior officers, a man called Madhav Sarup Vats, wrote to him about in April 1924. Madhav Sarup Vats had just completed a month excavation at Mohenjo-daro, and it was he who first pointed out the similarities that existed beyond the two sites, actually extended beyond dates and seals. This was something that the excavator had not highlighted. So this is the letter that Vats wrote to Marshall, and I think it's worth quoting in some detail. He says, the presence of dull, creamy flint scrapers and the blocks from which they are chipped, together with the general absence of coinage, as also the negative evidence regarding iron, of which not a single bit was found, goes to show that the site is very old. The essential bond between the so-called seals of the two places, the strongest and the most valuable link, as well as the crude caricaturing of the terracotta figurines, earth bangles, balls for slings, etc., which have been found are essentially of a kindred kind. Now, this ability to articulate very simply and elegantly the various congruences that had entirely escaped the more senior archaeologists is what makes Madhur Sarup Vats's letter a very audacious intervention. It was, it was marked by a boldness to actually stick his neck out by juxtaposing Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and suggesting that this was a parallelism that was being uncovered that ranged across an entire gamut of material culture. Marshall, of course, had neither seen Mohenjo-daro nor Harappa, but after he got this letter, he knew that he had to come to grips with the riddle of the relics of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, what they had thrown up. And he reckoned that the only way to do this was by simultaneously comparing the material. So that's what he decided to do. He decided to call a kind of a conference meeting of the concerned archaeologists and artifacts in Shimla, the summer capital of the government, and the place where his own office was located. By June, masses of material had reached Shimla, even bricks. So the task of comparing and correlating the bulk of the collections of the two sites could begin after this. Now, for the three men there, Marshall, Sahni, and Banerjee, this actually must have been the most exciting archaeological examination of their lives. The painted and the plain pottery, the chert knives and flakes, the seals with pictographic symbols, the stone beads, and so much else from the two sites was strikingly similar. The only person who had articulated the presence of an overarching archaeological identity was Vats. But surveying such similarities for himself, I think for John Marshall, was different, and also for Sahni and Banerjee, than reading about them. For many years, actually, Marshall had pondered on the possibility of finding antiquarian remains of the Bronze Age here. And now, unexpectedly, his officers had reclaimed a Bronze Age civilization. They had reclaimed it from under the alluvium of the Indus plains, where it had been waiting, as it were, to script a new story. That it was a meeting of archaeologists, a meeting in the company of artifacts and antiquities, which resulted in the recognition of a city civilization in India, I think is worth thinking about. Among scientists, meetings are very common, especially laboratory meetings. This is where data are first presented, when others also in such meetings suggest new experiments and reason with each other about these findings. And one of the consequences of frequent meetings like this is that it leads from the particular to the general, because the primary researcher is often frequently persuaded to consider other representations, to consider other explanations for data that was being considered, or for a theory that was being proposed. Now, in the case of the ASI of colonial India, on the other hand, there was no institutional space where archaeologists associated with it could actually discuss their digs or seek information from each other. In fact, it is unlikely that Sahni or Banerjee had actually even visited Harappa and Mohenjo-daro in each other's company, where they could have mutually discussed their finds. What was common to them was the figure of the Director General, to whom they addressed their letters and queries. So in other words, there was no tradition of face-to-face brainstorming here. And my own sense is that if there had been a mechanism which allowed ideas to converge and collide, possibly the space, would have worked differently. There would have been, a flow of information and inspiration, which would have resulted in a quicker discovery saga. So it's not merely fortuitous that it was a big meeting of minds and matter in Shimla in the summer of 1924, where the enormity and uniqueness of what was discovered at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa was first understood. that in the world of innovation and discoveries, the free flow of ideas and opinions can be crucial, is further borne out by what was following Marshall's announcement of the Indus civilization in the Illustrated London News. In England, there were scholarly readers of the 20th September issue of the Illustrated London News who reacted instantaneously. Among these was, the redoubtable AHCS, who was then a crusty old man pushing 80. He immediately dashed off a note which appeared 1 week later in the Illustrated London News on 27 September. In that note, he wrote that the finds were even more remarkable and startling than what Marshall had imagined. While Marshall's dating had not pushed it beyond the first millennium BC, Sayce pointed out that the seals which had been found at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa had actually been discovered at Susa in a context dated to the 3rd millennium BC. So, as he put it, it is evident that as far back as the 3rd millennium BC, there was intercourse between Susa and northwest of India. And he added, the discovery opens up a new historical vista, and it's likely to revolutionize our understanding of the ideas of the age and origin of the Indus civilization. So, this is how within a week, you had the dating of the civilization getting pushed back to the 3rd millennium BC. And this tells you that the networking of knowledge is actually very important. And the networking of knowledge in this case in London was as important and as crucial as the networking of knowledge that had happened at Shimla. So in conclusion, in reflecting on the discovery of the Indus civilization, in relation to the more general question of whether the process was similar to the trajectory of scientific discoveries, or if it was qualitatively different, I think the answer would be that it's a little of both. On the one hand, there is a consonance in the sense that, like major scientific developments, the Indus discovery was long in the making, the slow evolution of a hunch that fructified into a major breakthrough. There's also a way in which, in both processes, one can recognize the importance of unexpected discoveries and also the crucial role of networks in producing new insights. On the other hand, in the case of the Indus civilization, there were very material circumstances that were actually specific to it. These are connected with the nature of institutional archaeological research in a colony, the challenges that such research faced because of government priorities and constraints. John Marshall's was, of course, a slow hunch, but the pace of work in government departments was equally slow. And of course, along with this, there was a lack of institutional interaction, even as the Archaeological Survey grappled with shoestring budgets and the consequences of a war on another continent to which India at that point was connected with colonial ties. So it is such contextual elements in which discoveries unfold that make the comparison of archaeological breakthroughs with the history of scientific discoveries, I think, something which is an important area of future analysis. So I'm going to stop here.
We are really grateful for having you here and listening to such a wonderful talk on the discovery of the Indus civilization, the long phase of evolution which we see in the late 19th century culminated in the early part of 20th century. It had many stories behind that, and you have very beautifully and have given a detailed account of some of the important aspects which clearly led to the ultimate discovery and announcement of the discovery of the civilization. So now we will have some questions we have requested the participants to enter their questions in the chat box. I request Sharda to read out some of the questions, and I request Professor Lahiri to kindly answer.
Thank you, ma'am. So I will quickly scroll through the chat box and tell you the questions. So the first one is by Shikha Rai, who asks, did George Fletcher Macman's Marshall race theory for the population of northwestern proveniences influence Marshall's hypothesis about Aryan invasion theory?
So if I may say so, I wasn't talking about the Aryan invasion theory. And I think as far as John Marshall goes, if there was one thing that John Marshall consistently reiterated, it was that the Indus civilization emerged on the banks of the Indus and on Indian soil. So, I think we need to look at the original announcements to see that there was nothing about an Aryan invasion in anything that he wrote. Even for the decline of Mohenjo-daro, he actually gave a great deal of credence to the idea of the temperamental Indus River.
Thank you. So the next one is by Anas Padne, who asks, despite its availability in ample numbers and extensive research in the field for all these years, why do you think the symbols or the script on the Indus seals have not yet been deciphered? Apart from some assumptions, how the ambiguity in writing system affects the Indus civilization researchers?
So my sense is that the Indus script, the code has not been cracked, not because of a lack of effort. There are scholars who actually spent their entire working lives trying to crack the code. This has happened maybe the two real problems are that the inscriptions are very short. The longest Indus inscription is 24 characters, and the average Indus inscription is 6 characters. So, in that case, if you have such short inscriptions, if Prabhakar has one reading and I have another reading, there's a way in which you can just massage, those readings into the short inscriptions. The second reason is that no biscriptural or triscriptural inscription has been found. So, if there was an inscription which had characters of a Sumerian script and also, the Indus characters, maybe there would be a way in which one would, go forward. But I think these, for me, are the two main reasons.
There's another question related to the seals. This is from Uma Senthil, who asks, please share your opinion about the religious aspects interpreted so far from the Indus seals.
So, if you look at John Marshall's own writings, and I would tend to agree with that, he did see, elements of what became later day Hinduism. I don't think it's necessary, not necessary, but I think it becomes difficult to talk of Hinduism in its full form in the way we understand it in the latter part of the first millennium BC. But I think the elements that are there, the religious elements, remind you of Hinduism. This may well be in terms of, the so-called Pashupati seal, but even beyond the seals and of course, the plants emanating from the womb of a woman and so on and so forth. But beyond that, also beyond the seals, if you just think about Kalibangan and the fact that you actually have places for sacrifice on the Western mound with ablution platforms there. So, the whole idea, or if you think about the great bath of Mohenjo-daro, the importance that was given to water in the context of the civilization, all of this, or for that matter, that small, it's there in the Harappan gallery, there's a miniature phallic emblem set in a Gauri Patta, which for any worshipper, any Hindu would be, definitely a Shivalinga, miniature Shivalinga. All of this actually makes sense in terms of later day Hinduism. So, there are also elements of prehistory. Please keep that in mind. So, if you think about Baghor too, and if you think of the platform on which there is this very interesting stone that is kept for worship, that too is something that makes sense in terms of latter day Hinduism. So I think what Hinduism did was to bring together a whole lot of things. So if you're asking me, the religious elements, how do you interpret them? I would say that, well, these are the elements which seem to later become a part of what we describe as, Hinduism.
So Shikha Rai has another question. She asks, what is your opinion about N.G. Majumdar's contribution?
So, I mean, again, very unfortunate if you think about the fact that he's one of those archaeologists who got killed by dacoits in Sindh. But his contribution, to the archaeology of Sindh, especially the archaeology of Harappan sites in Sindh, is very, very major. And of course, Majumdar incidentally did not just make a contribution to Harappan, Harappan studies and Harappan field research. Remember, it was Majumdar who also contributed in a very major way to the volumes on the monuments of Sanchi. So, those are Marshall, Majumdar, and Foucher. Those are the three authors.
The next question is by Geeta Vasudevan, who asks, how significant were the efforts at interpreting the Indus script by Mahadevan?
So, I mean, Mahadevan has to be celebrated. The fact that here is a bureaucrat who gets posted to Delhi, and as he himself put it, he used to finish his work in the first 2-3 hours of the day. And then he used to go and visit his friend Shivarama Murthy in the National Museum, who then told him that, why don't you get interested in this, and so on and so forth. So, he did spend a great part of, his second avatar, that is that as a scholar, of scripts and inscriptions and so on. He did spend a lot of time. I mean, I'm not sure that everyone would agree with many of his interpretations, but still the fact that, he put together a great deal of data, showed, the congruences and so on and so forth, all that, requires acknowledgement.
Okay. So Sri Lakshmi asks, from which period can it be considered in Indian archaeology as excavation of the site to be a scientific discovery?
I actually, don't understand that. But for example, when you talk about stratigraphy and the importance of stratigraphy in archaeology, that actually comes from the sciences, from the earth sciences. And you can see that in the 19th century. You can see that in the work of the geologists who went on to make major discoveries in different parts of the Indian subcontinent, much before the 20th century.
So the next question is very interesting. Parth Chauhan, he asks, in your opinion, how might the discovery of Indus civilization have unfolded if the British had never colonized India?
Well, it may well have, started, it may well have started earlier, who knows? What if questions, Parth, are very difficult to, answer. But I have absolutely no doubt that, considering the way things were evolving in India too, because of the links with, different European countries and so on, even without us being colonized, all kinds of, discoveries would have been made, and there would have been archaeologists even without, the British. In fact, maybe it would have been much better because we wouldn't have been sitting with many of their theories, completely internalized into the way in which we understand Indian history. But I really can't answer that because I can answer what is there, but to answer a what if question, it's beyond my expertise. But thank you for the question.
He has a rejoinder. He says, sorry, Nayanjot, I couldn't help it. And there's a smiley, there's an emoji next to it.
That's good.
Okay, so just now a question has come in from Shikharai. Do you feel this search of Buddhist sites during the British era played a significant role in unearthing such old civilizations which pushed the antiquity of that region?
So, I mean, the search for Buddhist sites, began in the 19th century. And it began more systematically, it was done more systematically by Alexander Cunningham and his two assistants. I think the importance of that, beyond just the fact that it gave a material reality to Buddhism, is that, as a matter of fact, it gave a material reality to ancient India, because remember places like Taxila and Kosambi and Rajagriha and Sangala and so on. These are mentioned in all kinds of literature, not just Buddhist literature. So it's one thing to know about that there were these places in ancient India, but to actually give them a material reality that, you can pinpoint where they are, that is very important. And the Buddhist perspective is one aspect to them, but beyond that, there were other sorts of discoveries that were made there. And I think the advantage, even if you had a Buddhist-driven Alexander Cunningham, was that at the end of it, he was the man who was most responsible for giving ancient India a grassroots reality, where you could actually, he was the person who actually was able to, talk about the various places mentioned in texts on the ground. Now, this was also his shortcoming. Remember, he excavated Harappa, but because he looked at everything through literary spectacles, he thought he couldn't imagine of, a civilization going beyond the textual accounts. So when it came to interpreting what he had found at Harappa, even though his plate shows seals and stone blades, in spite of that, in spite of those being real aberrations, which he had not found anywhere else, when it came to interpretation, he said, well, this is Pofatolo, a place where Xuanzang lived for a few months, and so on and so forth. So it's not enough to just find a place and even excavate it. The perspective you take makes all the difference. And what was Cunningham's strength was also in the case of Harappa his weakness.
And the last question, I will leave it to Professor Danino. So he said, if there is time, and yes, we do have time for his question.
Thank you, Sharada. Professor Lahiri, my question was whether we can have an estimate of how much impact this whole discovery of this prehistoric, today we call it proto-historic civilization of India, had in the popular imagination of India and in the popular imagination of Europe, because let's not say the whole Western world, but how much, like you see the pyramids of Egypt, for example, struck the European public immensely, but do we have any measure to estimate what was the impact in India for the common Indians? How did they react to this discovery? And in Europe, was it noticed at all beyond the scholarly world?
Dr. Danino, the second question, it was widely noticed in the scholarly world. So there's no question about that.
But beyond the scholarly world.
I think it's worthwhile considering. I mean, maybe there's a young student who can do a paper on this, look at publication. This is something that I haven't done. So, I don't think I should answer it, because there may well be stuff, But talking about India, actually there was a lot of interest. And I'll just give you one example. It actually is there, facing the first page of my book. And I'm going to read it out. It's from the Larkana Gazette of 1926. It's an extract. It says, "The beauty of the dilapidated buildings and of articles discovered speaks volumes for ancient India and proves the truth of the historical statement that in ancient times, India was a great and powerful country and was not helpless as she is now. In view of this evidence of India's ancient greatness, Britain should treat her, if not as a superior, at least as an equal, and respect her and set her free immediately," right? So from the 3rd millennium BC discovery to seeing this. In fact, if you think about, John Marshall and the fact that he widely publishes, the details about the discovery in Indian newspapers, you realize what he's trying to do. He's trying to actually get people, ordinary Indians, to feel enthused about that, so that there is pressure on the British Raj. Remember that the budget had been cut down again in a very major way in 1923-24. And that's why only a month's excavation could have been done in Mohenjo-daro in March 1924. Now, what Marshall does is, by talking about the fact that this is as old as the 3rd millennium BC, and it is something that was nurtured on Indian soil, he wants popular pressure to be put on the government. And the pressure works, because in the Legislative Assembly, you then have the government, committing to a whole lot of money. I think 1 lakh to begin with, and 2.5 lakhs after that, and so on and so forth. So, there is, in the Indian context, there definitely is a great deal of excitement. And I mean, this is something worth thinking about in the European context. This is not something that I've done, but it's worth, for those who are interested in the history of discoveries, this is something that is worth looking at.
Thank you very much. I think the time has come, if we do not have other questions, the time has come to thank you very warmly for your time. We understood the depth of your research and the very important aspect of exploring how these discoveries take place. And we usually forget the whole context of those discoveries. And this is one of the greatness of your work, apart from many other areas in which you've worked, of course, is that you have given us the entire picture of how difficult it was to come up with the coherent view of this civilization, and despite all of the challenges, how it took place. So I think this is extremely important for students of archaeology, students of ancient Indian history also. And we're very grateful for your time, for your patience, and for all the magnificent books you keep writing, which we keep recommending to our students. Thank you so much, Dr. Nayanjot. And thanks to all those who took time to attend this lecture. I think from Archaeological Sciences Center, IIT Gandhinagar. Thank you, everyone. And we will now close this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.